Come all you jolly fellas, come listen to my song. It's all about the lumber boys and how they get along. They're a crowd of jolly good fellas as ever you may find. It's how they spend their winter months in hurling down the pine. At 4 o'clock each morning a boss begins to shout, heave out my jolly teamsters, it's time to start the route. The teamsters they will all jump up in a most fretful way. Where is me boots, where is me pants, me socks has gone astray. At 6 o'clock it's breakfast and every man is out. For every man who is not sick will sure be on the route. There's sawyers and there's choppers to lay the timber low. There's swampers and there's loggers to drag it to and fro.
Is the sound all right? Okay. No? This darn thing. What?
My delegation would like to submit to the Assembly a very short resolution when human personality will be regarded as greater concern than wealth or property or power, however great.
We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years we've done it, with one signature of a pen. You've reversed that.
And to feel like, as much as is possible in this kind of world, the master in his own house.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
But listen, you kid, don't get caught in the Canadian syndrome, where if it's Canadian, it's got to be bad. We're the best. I've been telling you the best.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Red Ensign. Today we start a new series, new intro for a new series, and we're going to be looking at an emerging part of the intellectual space, which in my opinion has begun to succeed the online right. That intellectual space is deeply concerned with the cultivation of virtue as a response to modernity. And I have with me a special guest, Johann Kurtz. Johann, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Johann has a new book out, which if you followed this show or followed my work more generally, you should already know about. I think it's called Leaving a Legacy. Is that the title?
Correct, yeah. Leaving a Legacy, Inheritance, Charity, and Thousand-Year Families.
So it's an interesting book. We'll get to the book as we go through, but this will not be a straight fill the book or review the book podcast. If you want to hear my thoughts on it, I did a detailed review with Stephen Carson over on his channel. Very interesting book, well worth your time. But I want to address Johann's work more generally today. And so, to begin the podcast, I wanted to enter the discussion by looking with a kind of longitudinal look at what I view as the intellectual responses to modernity that have occurred online that I consider serious. And I would say that intellectual response that emerged online began with the project to laugh at liberal modernity, liberal progressive modernity. So if you were around this part of the internet from 2005 through to 2016, the project was to make fun of progressives, right? All the early memes were about this. All of the early YouTube channels were about this. Figures like Mr. Medicare are survivors from this era. And people who were around at this time sincerely thought that they could get progressivism and liberal modernity back on course if they just laughed at it hard enough. They actually bought the narrative that the old world died from laughter, and they thought they could kill the new world with laughter. that project largely failed, and so there were a number of analytical responses that followed after it. Those analytical responses you can find in the era between sort of 2010 and 2020 a pretty wide set of analytical responses, ranging from, you know, I think Academic Agent's book, The Populist Delusion, typifies this period, but so does Yarvin's Unqualified Reservations work. So does Peter Thiel's early essays. The Straussian Moment is a good book from this period that is an analytical response to the crisis of modernity. That period was succeeded by a series of personal responses. So instead of analytical responses, there were accelerationist responses to try to thrive in modernity, responses from like those of BAP and Raw Egg Nationalist to try to figure out how to become the Nietzschean Superman who can thrive in the crisis of modernity. You see political responses like getting Trump elected, or Farage, or Brexit, or the various populist movements across Europe really peak out in this period, and they're a kind of low political response to the crisis of modernity. But what I view as a kind of emerging element of this response is of the response to modernity is an attempt to create intellectually robust arguments for that sit in behind traditions which would have been second nature during the period of the flowering of Western civilization. And I would characterize your work as very much of this current in reactionary thought. Is that a fair description?
I think so. Yeah. It's interesting. I haven't anticipated that framing, but I think it's a reasonable one. It's attempting to find an honest way to apply the philosophical and theological underpinnings of the old order to our present problems. So it's not a kind of kitschy and reactive traditionalism. Not to sound too dismissive of that segment of the sort of online return with a V right, and indeed many of my traditionalist Catholic contemporaries. But I think it's an attempt to really understand the problems that we're facing now and suggest strategies that are born out of the application of clarity derived from much older wisdom to our current situation.
Well, I think that's a great distinction to draw. There's a long, in older tradition in the online space of a kind of traditionalist reaction to modernity. And that traditionalist reaction to modernity tends to have been aesthetic in primary and emotional in argumentation. So you'll see, if you were on the internet from 2015 through to 2022, you'll be really familiar with this, especially in female-coded spaces. You'll see this kind of traditionalism, and it's presented really not as an argument. It's presented as a kind of as beautiful in contrast to ugly in its kind of reactionary presentation, which is an element which I think your work takes seriously, but that's not the primary current that drives your work. You're actually trying to recover the intellectual basis for that world. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think that there's a real temptation, to evoke the most beautiful images online that gather the most attention. There's a few paths you can go down, but most of them revolve around showing something that is in its mature state, that is the mature aesthetic product of a prior civilization. So a beautiful country house built 200 years ago, or a suit of armor from 1450, or the kind of trad wife barbecue aesthetic, et cetera, et cetera. And you can go on, and these things are, they should be remembered, and they should be even idolized, because it does demonstrate what we're capable of. But to sort of insist on them as a viable alternative to what we have in front of us sort of fails to engage with the underlying dynamics of why this very basic question of, there are wealthy American families now who are right wing. I mean, perhaps not in an explicitly online way that we would understand, but they are basically reactionary in their understanding of their Christianity. Particularly, the American Protestant community has some very conservative figures, and yet they do seem incapable of building in a variety of domains that are necessary to construct a mature civilization in the way that high Christendom once was, including in aesthetic domains. I mean, the lack of architecture, the lack of fine dress, these are sort of entranceways into understanding the sort of the thinness of the foundation that we're operating on. And I think this materializes in a lot of other ways. But I think you're absolutely right in implying that it's not quite good enough to simply cut to the end state of the mature fruit of a civilization and insist on it in that way.
Yeah, this is a really good point that I want to re-emphasize. The strategy of LARPing the product of a previous civilization has this problem where there's nothing underneath it. So sure, you can go out and you can dress like a Victorian gentleman, or if you've obtained enough wealth, you can homestead, or if you obtained enough wealth, you can buy a country house and you can start to try to live the aesthetics of this previous era. But if you lack there's a lot more to that thing which you admire than just its aesthetic instantiation. It was what it was because it was nested in a system, and it had a function in that system. And I think if you don't apply the intellectual rigor to kind of identify the function of the thing in the system, then you can't re-embody it properly, because what you'll end up with is like a living museum at best, or like a bad LARP at worst. And so if I look at your book, one of the things that I think is quite interesting about it is this discussion of the pass down of estates as like a functional, as forcing upon the next generation a set of functional roles and responsibilities that they can't easily dispense with as a way of communicating culture.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's the physical embodiment. In many ways, my book is one reflection of my deeper belief in the need to, in some sense, bring one's beliefs in a very direct way into the physical world if one is to truly claim and indeed believe in one's own heart that you believe them. What I mean by this is there's a long tradition in the online right, and I think for understandable reasons. This isn't to condemn it. We are in a very difficult situation, and we're a movement of young men that have long been in a very difficult situation. So this is not to cast judgment, but there is a long history of, and you see variations in this in every variation of the right-wing ecosystem, which you mentioned earlier. For example, the Vitalists, they talk a lot about being Nietzschean supermen, and yet actually, the fruits of that movement are a little bit difficult to identify. And in my own work, some of the themes that recur are, yes, this question of one's physical possessions as instruments, even those that we typically consider as aesthetic objects like country estates, as instruments of enacting one's values in a lived way in the world. But equally, ritual, which is something I discuss in the book, and something that I was very happy to hear that you and Stephen discussed on his stream. Ritual is, in some sense, a taking of one's beliefs and finding ways to repeat them again and again in physical actions and gatherings which reflect those beliefs, which find some way of instantiating those beliefs. And in bringing them into the physical world in some way, you're expressing confidence in them. They're no longer a fantasy or a private thing that you reflect on while you're by yourself, or something that you post about via an online account. There's something that you communicate as defensible values that you embody, and I choose that word carefully, and that your family embodies. And so they sort of become more real to you. This is actually quite a Christian idea, that the idea of liturgy is one in which there's a very direct correspondence between word and action. They're things that flow together. So that I think you're quite perceptive in picking that up as a kind of deeper theme of the book.
Well, there's a great deal there that I want to pull apart for the audience a little bit. I want to start by pointing out the epistemic you choose in the book to communicate your point. You make some didactic argument, but I would say the primary mode of communication is to review the narratives of those who successfully communicated a legacy and those who failed to communicate a legacy in various ways in the book. And I think this is an interesting. We talked earlier about the failure of aesthetic posting to communicate the underlying logic associated with the kind of pinnacle of old Christendom's civilization. I think you try to strike a bit of a balance in the book by this heavy use of example to try to communicate what has worked and what has not worked, and really to advance. I mean, in my opinion, about a third of your book is a discourse on the principle of Christian and charity, and why Christian principles of charity correspond with reality in a way that something like effective altruism or managerial charity do not. And you don't make that argument didactically very much. You instead pick up an organization like the Ford Foundation and use it to demonstrate the argument. Do you want to speak a little bit about that choice of rhetorical technique, and maybe a little bit about how it informs how you look at the history of Christendom, and how you look at our view of our ancestors, our view of our traditions?
Sure. Let me offer a reflection that I don't think is quite directly answering your question, but it's
Sure.
one that I haven't thought out loud before in an explicit way. So it might be quite interesting to do it here with you, and then you can sort of redirect my question to answer whatever that doesn't answer. The book was designed, I think, quite obviously to any one of our guys who reads it, to be someone that wasn't just, as in many ways my blog is, a message to our guys to sort of reify their beliefs. But I was trying to present it in every way in a form that could kind of punch out of our sphere and actually try and convince particularly elder boomers who didn't already believe what we believed. And the book is actually quite radical in some ways. I mean, I talk about how, I represent a much more acceptable version of, I probably don't even want to say it on your podcast, because the distant right formulation of this is a bit problematic, should we say? But the idea that money being infinitely pumped into Africa will actually have adverse consequences for them and for us at some point. Calamity will come just because you're exponentially increasing mouths to feed without actually building a civilization which is capable of sustaining them against systemic shock. These kind of ideas are quite radical, but I attempt to present them in a way which is compelling to someone that doesn't already, believe the litany of beliefs that we do. And so I was presented with this challenge, which was, well, really the first thing that has to be addressed, the kind of central question is a moral one. Like, what is the best thing to do with your money? Like, who do you have a duty to? And everyone associates the morality of money with this notion of charity. So I kind of have to address this head on at the outset. And I toyed around on my blog. I did like a few draft versions of this chapter in ways that were supposed to be approachable to a broad audience, as in they referenced Christianity a little bit, but also, Aristotle and more general philosophical ideas and a kind of intuitive logic. And none of it was compelling. And that, frankly, like, I felt that as a Christian, I was letting myself down. Like, I prefer to just speak straightforwardly about my beliefs. And so I opened this book, which is kind of designed in every section to be appealing to a broad and intuitive to a broad swathe of people, including like post-Christians. But I couldn't find a way, and indeed at a certain point I didn't want to find a way, to not just go hard on theology in the first chapter. And I thought that was really gonna like hold back the spread of the book and interest in the book. I mean, it goes pretty deep into like translations of Koine Greek and comparative translation between Hebrew and Greek and so forth, which is pretty niche stuff. But it really hasn't, like, I've been invited on some of the biggest Bitcoin podcasts, for example, to talk about this with like major Bitcoin influencers. I've got guys in different spaces. The book was featured today, and I'm very grateful for this, for the guy that organizes it, but in one of the largest family offices newsletters in the world. So this is a newsletter, for those that don't know, Black Horse of course will, but a family office is essentially like a private investment bank for an ultra high net worth family. And these are by no means Christian organizations. This is a global newsletter, and they were willing to feature this as their like read of the week. So I don't know exactly what's going on, but definitely these figures who run these things, again, who I'm very grateful to, I don't think they would have had the confidence to center quite such a radical, and they've all read this book, to center quite such a radical, like Christian deep dive 10, 15 years ago. Like, that very much would not have been in the culture. And so whatever's going on, there is a willingness to engage with stranger ideas, radical ideas, metaphysical propositions in a way that we just didn't have at the height of our sort of like civilizational drought in the kind of 2005 to 2010 period. And I think that's very encouraging.
Well, I think there's something here in that I could respond 10 different ways to that set of comments. But what I want to point out here to you and to our audience is that in this moment where the broad culture and particularly elite culture is in a kind of crisis of identity, there's tremendous power in speaking with confidence from a particular tradition, rather than trying to apologize for the fact that you belong to a particular tradition. And so the choice to just explicitly make the Christian argument for what charity is and connect it in with the tradition of our civilization, I think is a very powerful one, in that you're able to speak as a person with a particular identity to a broad audience.
Yeah, and I think it's actually it's related to that idea I brought up earlier. Sorry, 1 second. I'm just going to clear my throat. It's related to that idea I brought up earlier of there are certain tells as to whether you are so confident in an idea that you actually believe it, that you actually allow it to guide your life, and you don't just sort of like toy with it as an intellectual tool or something that you claim to believe but clearly don't. One of those ways, as mentioned earlier, is physically instantiating it and living it in some very direct way. But another is talking about these ideas without a hint of concession to a culture which hates them. There was a figure who was very formative on my return to the Catholic faith in my early 20s. And I haven't spoken about this too much online. Catholics will know who I'm talking about. It may be that people outside that don't, but there's a famous, somewhat controversial figure in the Catholic world who's a sort of radically traditionalist character called Taylor Marshall. He's a Texan traditionalist Catholic, Latin Mass Catholic. And when I returned to the faith, I was sort of seeking out. I was in a pretty uncertain place myself, and none of my friends were Catholic. I didn't really come from a strongly Catholic community. I went to an Anglican school, although my family are Catholic, somewhat weakly so. And a lot of the guys I was finding were like incredibly knowledgeable about the faith. Guys like Jeff Caven, who's a very famous theologian in the Catholic world, but who were presenting their views, although I do think they truly believe them, but in such a gentle way as to it didn't hit me like it hit me the first time I heard someone like Taylor Marshall speak, who didn't have like an ounce of give in his voice. It was like, okay, this guy, like, he believes this so strongly that he realizes that what he is saying is going to alienate all kinds of people, and he's not offering a hint of an apology. Like, there's something in that conviction that is actually, that has a power to move you, to pull you out of, in a very striking way, kind of mundane existence in which everyone is compromising with everyone else. There's an aspect of negotiation in our sort of mercantilized world, our capitalist world, to every discussion. In a transparent society, everything is something of a, oh, you believe that? That's interesting. I believe this. This is the background I come from. That's the background you come. To hear someone just like hit you over the head with a hammer of belief, like, this is, he doesn't say this is what I believe. He just says this is what it is, and there's zero given his voice. That's an incredibly seductive proposition, and I think one that is important.
Well, and I think so. If you go back through the archives of this podcast, you'll find a discussion I did with Athenian Stranger on the on repressive tolerance, right? The framing of the world. The framing of the sort of post 1945 world in terms of into a structure which deliberately blunts off these affirmative identities. The kind of assertiveness that you're discussing stands out very starkly in contrast to that world. And in that way, I think that this is part of what I was trying to get at in the way in which your book is presented. It's in some ways, the choice to present it the way that it is presented is actually in keeping with the aesthetic presentations that we saw in a less sophisticated form online, right? It's a kind of confidence in your own identity that is rarefied in this atmosphere. And I think that's incredibly attractive to people. And so I think that's one of the things that's interesting about the book, but I think it places well in the broader. I want to talk a bit about your broader project, the Becoming Noble Substack, because I think that the Becoming Noble Substack as a body of work is really an effort to recover or to put forward very simple arguments through this prism. So I looked at some of your articles that you've presented there. Beyond Time, Is Work Still Dignified? Why Did Wealth Stop Building Beautiful Things? The Ritual Protected Nation. A lot of these are meditations that are they're formulated in this same kind of way. They're arguments by example. They look like they're targeted at a pretty broad audience, and maybe you don't think that, but if you compare that to the audience profile that this podcast is targeted at, it's like 100,000. There are 100,000 times the number of potential people who are an audience for Becoming Noble than there are that are potential audience members for the Red Ensign. I just think that's that's an interesting strategy and really compelling. And I also think that it's an incredible. I wrote an article earlier this year called "It's Time for the Right to Grow Up," and one of the arguments that I made in that article is that an attribute of leadership that members of the online right community should look at is a set of leaders who both share the consequences of the decisions they recommend to their followers, and that leaders who consider deeply the consequences of those decisions and are prepared to embody them. And I think the aesthetic you're putting forward here, there's I'm losing how to explain this, but there's something like deeply noble about this way of trying to lead and persuade.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, becoming noble was a pretty grandiose term.
Yes.
And I'm sort of aware of that. I mean, in a way, I was trading in the exact thing that I was sort of decrying earlier, which is I think that what a lot of guys in our space do. In fact, I was kind of thinking of our very good mutual friend Kroptos in this, is they choose branding and labeling, which is entirely opaque to the outside world. And that creates a space in which you can do very interesting things, but it does place limits on growth and conversion and so forth. Like, I strongly suspect Kroptos would have twice as many followers on Twitter if he didn't have Greek Cyrillic like letters as his handle, because I assume a lot of people just don't visit his profile, or they land on the profile and they're like, wait, this isn't anything I understand or language I speak, or what is this? I'm confused. I have no idea what this page is about. And they click off, even if they would have been like interested and maybe sympathetic if that had been formulated in a different way. So there is, of course, like this contradiction, hypocrisy, whatever you want to call it, at the heart of the blog, especially given that I am not a noble myself, nor do I anticipate becoming noble in any formally understood way. But it's funny, like the stuff that I find myself most interested in, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is to kind of build a pipeline to changing reality in some small, humble way, in that there's kind of you might say, the Twitterverse is a very ephemeral one, full of hot takes. It's reactive. Things are forgotten. It never really substantiates into a body of thought. Like, there's a lot of people who are very famous on the online world who it's kind of difficult to, and I'll offer here an example, and I'm not trying to draw anyone into any controversy, but like a guy like Nick Fuentes is online all the time. He's very famous. He's very politically engaged. And yet, if you ask me what his platform was, like what his coherent like mission was, I would struggle to answer that. Even though I'm somewhat familiar with his work, I've watched a fair amount of his stuff over the years, because it changes, because it's built on it. He doesn't like throw this line in the sand at any point. So there's something of like what is the worst at this? Slightly better is Substack, where you have to at least write long form, and then better than that is a book where you have to like actually say, like, I'm going to cohere all this into a vessel which I anticipate will have to stand the test of time to some degree, and people will be able to return to and judge me against this set of declarations that I made and that I intended to be stable. And then after that, you actually have action in the real world, and ideally, eventually, action that is not just personal but actually communal in some sense. That it's in commune, in covenant with other people. And I'm not there yet, but I'm trying to make this transition between book and real life. But I think for me, the recurring, despite the grandiose title of Becoming Noble, all the articles that I've had the most fun writing emerge out of the same pattern, which is like, there's an observation that something in the culture is very stuck, just going in the wrong direction. And everyone kind of understands it's going in the wrong direction, but people don't understand why, or why it can't change. And a lot of this has to do with, we're a bit like a civilization which has inherited a lot of tools and things that we just don't understand on a deep level. We don't understand what terms mean. We don't understand why certain ritual practices that our civilization continues were first constructed. We just don't understand a lot of how these things fit together and why we have them in the first place. And just like when you start just really drilling into either single concepts or like two concepts and their interrelation, you can have these very interesting revelations. And probably my most significant article in terms of reach was this one on status and fertility. It was called "It's Embarrassing to be a Stay-at-Home Mom," and it basically asks this very simple question, which is like, why don't women want to be mothers now? And like they will claim they do, but why do they not act that way? And this concept of status, which is the sort of engine of the piece, that the concept the entire piece revolves around, is a single thread, but it's such a deep one, and you can trace status and femininity and success and adulation all the way through hundreds of years of history, and it like charts this very perfect journey. And I kind of got lucky in that one, in that in tracing that history, it turned out to be a very rich seam, and sometimes that isn't the case. But I think that method, it's, you would think it's just an academic one, but in fact, it's a very empowering one, because once you understand what you have and why, it's a bit like trying to solve a maths question before you like have the equation clear in your head, like the way that different things are supposed to relate. And once it like fits together, suddenly you're actually much more empowered to act, because you're not like stuck in this morass of confusion. So I try to do a bit of that in the book with things like nepotism and meritocracy and charity, philanthropy. Like, what do these terms actually mean, so that we can be in a place where whatever the decision we take is, we feel clear-headed and confident in action.
Well, and one of the corollaries to that method is that though the title of the project is becoming noble, the application of the constructs applies up and down the social spectrum. So if you look at the book, Leaving a Legacy, it's nominally about inheritance and charity, concepts which are I mean, when you present the book, you often present the book in the context of the large wealth transition that's occurring in Western societies right now. But in my reading of the book, that element is actually subordinate to what I would view as a very universal element. Regardless of your level of assets, regardless of the state of, like, the stage of your family you're at, these really fundamental teachings about how families ought to manage themselves in order to become greater, in order to relate to their communities in a way which is productive mutually. These are lessons which are very, very widely applicable. One that I hear repeatedly from people who have looked at the book is the applicability of the enforcement of ritual as a means of communicating purpose generationally. Children understand ritual in a way that they don't understand didactic teaching, right? Children understand symbolism in a way that they don't understand the didactic. And so there's tremendous power in these kinds of things that you do repeatedly as a family, and that you make them, that you do even when you don't want to do them, and that you make your children do even when they don't want to do them. I think there's and this is a pattern which is repeated across much of your work, that nominally, you know, it's marketed as though it was targeted at the rich and famous, and yet in reality there's simple meditations on deep principles of how to cultivate virtue.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. There's the book is operating on two levels. At the first level, and the most important level, and the one you're identifying, is like an exposition of my thought, both because it's very useful in clarifying that to myself, and also because, you know, I believe these ideas are correct, and it's useful putting them down on paper in a structured form such that other people can understand their thoughts. Because a lot of people like intuitively agree with these positions, but they don't quite have the moral language to articulate why. And hopefully by giving them that formal framework, they can feel more confident in engaging people on these issues. But there was it's funny. It's kind of orthogonal, but there was a sense of professional pride in the book, and I think that one of the things that I am that has disappointed me in the past, it doesn't disappoint me in the people, but it disappoints me in the outcome, is some guys in our space don't treat books with the seriousness that they should. And what I mean by that is, like, they'll take a compendium of their essays, for example, and they'll stick them all in a PDF, which they'll upload to Amazon and sell as like a new product, which is like the essays, 2015 to 2025, whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that. And, and frankly, anything that gets our guys a modest paycheck and gets people's hands on a nice physical object, all the better. But there is an art to making a book, and there is an entire body of wisdom about what really makes a good book land and make a mark in the consciousness. And I'm not saying for a second that my book is a perfect embodiment of this. I mean, that would be extremely grandiose, right? I have like across platforms like 50 reviews on Amazon right now, so this is not a bestseller by any means. But there is this combination of things, which is like, why now? Why is this idea now? And how are you going to frame it? Because the leaving a legacy framing, in a way, you're absolutely right. It's really about this question of charity and children and value transmission. But it was framed as leaving a legacy because I had a very specific target audience in mind that I wanted to convince of a very specific thing, and I needed to find a way to get them to pick up the book. So the whole thing was kind of like strategic from the end goal that I was trying to achieve with the book, and then I worked backwards to be like, what are all the things that this book needs to satisfy to achieve that thing? Now, again, I'm not saying I succeeded in that task to a great degree, but it's like, I don't know.
If I can cut across you for a minute here, so you've come back a couple of times to this reality that you're trying to speak to a specific audience. In this case, if I intuit correctly, you're trying to speak to older boomers who are in an asset in the period of their life where they're deciding upon the disposition of their assets. As a target to try to get them to do that well for the sake of the future of our civilization. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's about right. And then also, like, the secondary audience would be their children, who are much more likely to be readers of me, who would then have something to gift, or at least a way to engage on these ideas with them.
Or at least, I mean, from their point of view, even if they don't engage with the people disgorging themselves of the assets, picking it up is a way of understanding how to pick up the obligations that go with coming into assets well. Like I know in my own broader family, the process of picking up the responsibilities associated with the assets of a previous generation as they come into your hands is a process that, frankly, there are a lot of people who might be in your audience who would be insufficiently well-formed to do well, right? And so they might repeat the disasters of the Ford Foundation or something like this, where they pick up the assets and they end up doing either no good with them or more harm than good with them, which is kind of an interesting, like, in a sense, the boomers are right about their children. They're just, it's like a difficult thing,
Yeah, I mean, this is why, it's funny, when I wrote the book, I went through this cycle of like hope and then despair and then hope. And one of the reasons for that was about halfway through the book, as my ideas for how I wanted to present everything and who I wanted the target audience to be were sort of really cohering, I wanted to do a kind of literature survey, as it were. So I looked out into the space to see what else there was. And I was kind of convinced, I'm sure this will be a new addition to the space, because I know that there are tax planning services. I know that there are financial and investing planning services, legal planning services for these wealthy multi-generational families. But I bet they don't have like pet philosophers or theologists doing these things.
And then I actually discovered that, they have a huge collection of pet philosophers. They're just terrible.
Right, exactly. So the trough of my despair was like, oh my goodness, these people have an entire ecosystem of psychologists with books, of what's called succession planning strategists with books, etc. And I thought, this is just, I'm going to look ridiculous because I'm not plugged into the space in the way that these guys are. I don't have any experience like doing formal planning with these families. I know some of these kind of families in real life. But I'm just, this is going to look like a very amateurish outsider effort. And then I started reading the books, and then I thought, like, oh my goodness, these people do not understand their own field at all, and
they're
it's
horrendous.
It's not subtle. Yeah, I mean, like, there was this one book. It was one of the first things I read, and that's when, like, I very quickly entered out of the trough of despair and back into the soaring optimism. I mean, actually, it's tragic. So, but it's written by a psychologist who operates in the multi-generational high net worth family field, and there, she has several chapters devoted to this problem of children who feel alienated from the family business, typically third generation children or second generation children from the family business, and who don't want to reapproach it. In fact, they often want to reject wealth altogether because for various reasons, it's had a very alienating effect on their relationship with themselves, their friends, and their family. And you look at this, and if you look at it deeply, you can see the precise set of structural reasons which has led to this reality. To give an example, a lot of boomers have done a thing where, even though they are conscious that they are tremendously wealthy, and they are in an unusual situation, they've insisted that their children went to public school and did not socialize with other ultra wealthy kids because they didn't want them to be spoiled in some sense.
Yeah,
But
this was
they've
literally
then
my childhood. Like, I was
yeah.
sent to a Canadian public school, and like every other person in my neighborhood growing up went to a 20,000 a year plus private school, and I went to the local public school until I was taken out to a school for the gifted. But and it was explicitly, my parents drilled into me, you need to learn to get along with people of all social classes, um, which is like, I don't know. It's an interesting, uniquely boomer way to approach this problem.
Well, yeah, I think it makes a degree of sense if you don't believe that there is actually an intrinsic value to a hierarchical society in which there is a defensibly upper class. There is a role for an upper class to play. But of course, like, and I don't need to tell you this, but for the audience, like, the inevitable outcome of this is children are extremely self-conscious about being the odd one out. They are aware that their wealth demarcates them from everyone else in that community. They become paranoid that a lot of people are only friends with them for their wealth. They cannot associate with the life goals or ambitions of those around them who are making very tactical plans to get them the income that they need to survive, while they have no similar sense of calling. So their entire life plan, their entire state of reality, their like ontological place is just different from everyone around them, but they have no one to talk to about that. So it's this very alienating structural experience. The book does not mention any of that I'm talking about, this psychologist book. The whole book is about finding your mission, finding your you, finding the thing that is special to you, and finding a way to make wealth work in the service of that. So it's like this, it's a kind of like a boomer message all over again. It's like, it's all about you, and your, what's your thing? What's your, I can't remember what she calls it. She calls it some like saccharine sweet calling type thing. And I was like, oh, this is horrible.
Well, and missing from this entire body of literature is actually the thing which I was raised, which was inculcated from me subconsciously by both my parents and grandparents, is this like deep sense of duty. And I find like most of these families actually do inculcate this, right? Because one of the things that people who are very successful have of other people around them is expectations. And when you lay expectations on children, it inculcates a sense of duty without necessarily identifying what that duty ought to, like pairing a telos with that sensibility. And so one of the real struggles that I think a lot of people have as they come into manhood in that world is attaching like an appropriate telos that feels organic to them with the sense of duty and sense of drive that they feel is appropriate to a man who actualizes in the world. And like this entire body of literature completely fails to like it considers the attempt to impose a telos on that sensibility as like insanely authoritarian, the kind of thing, basically fascist, right?
Yeah, there's a really interesting streak in America, maybe in Canada too, but I'm more familiar with America, where the American upper classes have lost an understanding of what the calling, what the duty, what the role, what the, absolutely essential foundation and need for a stable upper class is. And as a result, you find in many subtle ways they reflect this. To give an example, there is a real tradition, and I'll give Tucker Carlson as an example here, someone who I basically like, and often like quite a lot. But Tucker Carlson is an upper class guy. He is now tremendously wealthy. He is influential. He networks with presidents. And yet in his self-presentation, it's gravitated over time to this kind of like rustic, folksy, kind of fisherman aesthetic. And you see this with a range of upper class figures in the States. And it materializes in various ways. Their aversion to architecture. I mean, it's a little bit deeper than this because some do try and build monstrosities, but it's a vision of a class which has lost confidence in itself and therefore doesn't want to be seen as something different. Doesn't want. Well,
they don't want to be seen at all, right?
Yes, exactly.
And in some sense, an aristocracy with that kind of self view, like my view is that the Canadian aristocracy, which is more visible and more stagnant than the American aristocracy, it's harder to penetrate because of the way, because of the particular history of the country. But it's almost suicidal, in that it cannot make the assertion that it itself is good. That its history is good, that its identity is good, that it should be carried forward into the future. And as a consequence, it creates these children which are profoundly listless and live only to they live in John Lennon's Imagine, because they can't imagine a telos which they wouldn't be embarrassed about embodying.
And it's such a loss for society at large. I mean, I'm very far from being a fan of the British royal family at the moment. But can you imagine how robbed the nation would have been if in the royal weddings over the last 10 years, they had not gone full pomp and circumstance? The nation as a whole would have suffered. Even the most meager, hairdresser or nail technician would have suffered because someone in society had not played their role in honoring them and casting honor on them by as a body politic, as a member of a common commonwealth, as a member of the same nation. You feel pride in the representatives of your nation. You feel pride knowing that the people who lead your nation are excellent. They are different. We love great leaders, and whenever someone fails to step up to that, whenever someone says, I'm just another guy, they think of that, as a kind of like
as an expression of humility, but it's not. It's
right.
a dereliction of their appropriate role.
Yes, exactly. And it society at large crumbles. It's almost communistic in that everyone has to appear the same.
This is where I think biblical anthropology has a tremendous contribution to make, in just the simple assertion, which would have been intuitive to most people through history, that an individual or even like a nuclear family is an incomplete unit of humanity, that like the smallest viable unit of humanity includes a male status hierarchy. It's maybe something like a tribe or a small village or something. And that male hierarchy, its existence, the ability to manifest at every level, is an essential part of what, like without that, you're kind of an incomplete unit. You can't express a culture. You're not transmissible generationally. And it ties back to this point that I make over and over and over again, because members of our current ruling class are kind of interested in the fertility question because of the implications it has for their economic project. And I point out that, like, this is not a resource question. This is the idea that people are too poor to afford children just flies in the face of all history. The idea that they're too impaired by contraceptives or other reflections of their physical health doesn't stand up to even kind of basic scrutiny. What separates this society from the societies which have had high fertility, and mainstream society from subpopulations that have high fertility, is this sense of social place. The idea that the sacrifices that you make in order to bring forth the next generation are meaningful, and they're meaningful because they're part of something that's bigger than yourself. And I think this is intimately tied up with this self-extinguishing impulse that exists in our upper class, that they're just afraid to positively assert the value of our civilization, the value of the very thing that they would like to call the body politic to sacrifice for.
It's interesting you bring up fertility. There's so much I want to cover. I'm going to make let me come back to fertility. I'm going to make a 20-second observation on something you said earlier about the smallest viable compound of humanity. I mentioned that I think American society has become deranged because those at the top of society have become dislocated from their proper role as aristocrats. But I think there's another phenomenon which is equally true, kind of at the bottom separatist layer, which is that the American self-conception of the kind of righteous working class attitude to dysfunction is the homesteader model. You go off as a single family and you live on the prairie by yourself. And that's also ahistorical. Like if you look at the colonies that founded America, if you look at those that came out of John Winthrop, the Puritan colonies in Massachusetts and so forth, what you had were incredibly intense small units of society. You had homes and villages and towns in commune with each other. And it was only later, as the expanse opened up, as certain security guarantees were made, and the nature of the native population versus the establishment of the founding colonies was more concrete, you had this kind of second wave who were regarded with a degree of suspicion by the Puritan society, who went off to try and do this kind of homesteading thing with mixed success. So in some sense, that is not the founding virtue of the American working class vision either. And the kind of like the overemphasis on exit amongst some places on the right, I think is like, and I'm not putting myself as an expert on early American history here, but yeah. I do think that these aesthetic models have a resonance which has, if they're not properly understood,
I think it's interesting. We actually began this podcast with an intro looking at a Canadian logging camp from actually the 1920s, is where that footage comes from. People's imagination of what these places were like is totally disconnected from, like, these are deeply hierarchical and deeply socially bonded organizations. If you read what the people who actually lived in them wrote about them, these are people who had like friends as close as brothers for decades at a time, bonded in this like profound struggle for survival. In the kind of early American case, often against the native population. In the case of the frontier, bonded by the struggle against the environment. And I think it's because we live in a reality, or most of us have lived in a reality where the struggle for survival is not actually that salient. It's hard to intuit the way that these people lived, which is one of the reasons why I think, I'm talking to you today. At some point, I'm going to talk to someone who I can talk to about the value for male development, of subjecting yourself to physical suffering, pain, and struggle against the elements. But it's like there's something about that part of what a human is that is very hard for people who have, grown up with always having a full belly, always never being frozen, never having to depend on another person to live, in the kind of like never having to depend on somebody else to shoot the bear that's coming over the hill. That kind of robs people of an understanding of what this world was like.
Yeah, you just life takes on a different quality when you realize how close death is. I'm not sure if you ever had a near-death experience, but it does transform you. I mean, even in this such a modest version of what you're talking about, but it's at the top of my mind for me at the moment. Is like, I've been a corporate guy for my entire life up until 4 months ago, when I quit my job and moved to Romania to try and build this thing. And my family now depends for bread on my personal success and excellence every day. Like it's just like the safety net is gone, and the entire phenomenological experience of being a father changes as a result. Like that level of threat and vulnerability and stakes and risk and opportunity, it just like magnifies the entire bonds of the family start making more sense, and authority and deference and so forth, in a context of risk, suddenly all start gluing together in a way that a lot of structures that people have drifted away from, but that someone like you and I would agree are essential, that becomes impossible to ignore in the right context.
Well, it's interesting because when I was a young teenager, my father went through a period where the business was struggling, and he didn't, fundamentally he didn't take a paycheck for a period of time. And I remember very distinctly a moment when a very unexpected bill, like a pretty large unexpected bill, came in the door, and the just pain on his face when he realized the implication of it. These are, and we had, anyways, there's a lot of biographical details that go to explain something like that, but there's something which is necessary to the masculine experience in particularly the aristocratic masculine experience in participating in the power. Like, this is where I think Ted, I think the man who is euphemistically known on YouTube as Uncle Ted was so profoundly right in discussing participation in the power process as this fundamental aspect of masculinity, which is robbed by the modern world. And I think an essential part of figuring out how to pass through the crisis of modernity is reconnecting with the power process as a man, and becoming capable of the things which are likely to be expected of us in the future. Anyways, we're coming up on an hour here, and I'm conscious of your time. Is there anything else you wanted to really address on this podcast before we kind of wrap it up?
Let me just close one thought that I opened up earlier and I didn't, which was the question of fertility. There's a demographer called Lyman Stone who's very influential in the world of fertility. He's at the Institute of Family Studies. I think he's their lead demographer, and he's on Substack as well. He's very, very important in terms of doing a lot of the statistical work that goes into informing downstream discourse analysis of fertility trends that you will have seen on Twitter. I borrowed a lot of graphs from him for some of my work.
Yeah.
And his conviction is basically that this is all reducible to the marriage rate. That if you look at those people who have got married and the age at which they got married, and you control for those two things, that surviving fertility is basically the same. So like TFR is a bit distorted by the fact that infant mortality used to be a lot higher. But if you look at the number of surviving infants that people have and the period at which they settle, it's about stable for that cohort. I don't think you can really make that claim so cleanly, because getting married itself is an expression of all kinds of other things.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
that being
like,
said,
here's a really interesting question. Why did the average age of marriage in the late 19th century in England climb so quickly?
do you have an answer to that, or is that just an interesting open question? Because
Well,
I'm fascinated.
it's an open question. I mean, I have some answers to it, but they're not, shall we say, conclusive answers. I think it has to do with the crisis of British civilization, right? So if you go back and look at the literature and culture of that period, it struggles with this same. So, like, the early British Empire is based on a kind of it is an expression of Protestant Christendom to some degree, but it's also an expression of the peculiar British race as they kind of self-understood it. And the success of the colonial empire really undermines this, and it drives, and not only that, the profound dislocations that come with the industrial period really undermine this as well. And so, without the telos of continuous war that kind of served the empire from 1750 to 1850, they survive the period of war because it provides a telos to all the second sons. But but in the period after the kind of continuous wars of the empire, where they become more and more frivolous and convey less and less status in the late 19th and early 20th century, the kind of Edwardian period, you find a crisis of marriage actually not dissimilar to the modern crisis of marriage, and a concomitant crisis of fertility, which I find very interesting. And it ultimately culminates in a society which is like the United Kingdom in the First World War loses a much smaller fraction of its population than it does in the Napoleonic wars, and yet it is far more catastrophic to the civilization, because in this position of being a relatively low fertility society, they can't sustain, particularly the aristocratic classes cannot sustain their civilization through that kind of a shock in the way that they could in the early 19th century. And you find a parallel in Germany, where the experience of the war and the famine associated with the war and the profound disruption of all the local communities in Germany that occurs during the war actually causes in a non-reversing crisis in fertility in Germany. I mean, it gets disrupted by the Second War, but it looks like, so in a period of like 10 years, Germany goes from a TFR of like 7 to a TFR of under 2, and does not recover at any period as a result of this collapse in marriage, collapse in local community, collapse in this kind of telos of how life was in the racinated countryside. I think it's hard to go from that to how to reconstruct, but I just think it's very important and very informative to kind of understand how this all happened to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I was going to say was, if you, and by the way, that was fascinating. And if you haven't written a piece on that, I hope you do, because I'd like to chew on that for longer. But the only thing I was going to say is, like, if you grant Lyman his argument that marriage is the key to all of this, and because it probably is, there is this thing, like the crossing of the threshold of marriage does still seem to have some causal factor, even now, even within particular communities. And it is, in some sense, related, I think, to this ritual dimension, which I was talking about earlier, which is a lot of people say they want children. Still, the supermajority of people say that they want children, or at least of women, a lot do, far more than ever go on to have children. and it's the transformation of belief into public assertion in front of a crowd in a ritual setting with the taking of oaths that presents a kind of threshold of confidence and stability by which one's values can begin to be materialized productively in the real world. So anyway, it's just a kind of interesting observation in that, like,
well, it's interesting because marriage and children, in my opinion, both of them separately and each of them and both of them together, in my opinion, are always acts of faith. Because, you know, I mean, I remember when I was in my early 20s getting married. If I had conceptualized it as a rational bet on my future economic prospects, I could have found, you know, an infinitude of arguments not to get married. Instead, I conceptualized it differently because of the background that I had. And it turned out that the rational bet succeeded on economic grounds. But that's not why that decision is ever taken, you know?
Sorry, struggling to find the unmute button. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's the same in my case. We got married. Basically, like, if you follow, we sort of converted to Catholicism, we being my now wife and I, after we were already dating, and we started taking Catholicism pretty seriously a couple of years into that. And once you follow Catholic or Christian sexual ethics seriously, you very quickly realize, like, oh yeah, we've got to get married, because otherwise this relationship is not going to last long.
Yeah, I mean, you have what my evangelical audience will quickly recognize, that the define the relationship conversation, and then how long is it between the define the relationship conversation and when you have to decide whether you're really going to get married or not, right? Before my wife and I went on our first date, I made clear that in my mind, dating was like a prelude to marriage. So if that's the premise of your relationship, how long can it really continue without taking that step?
Yeah.
So anyways, Johann, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Everyone in the audience should be sure to go and check out your latest book, but also to go, it's the Becoming Noble Substack. Is that the correct title?
Yep, becomingnoble.substack.com.
And you'll find a number of really excellent meditations there on habits that existed in the old world, but maybe you never really thought about or figured out how to reinstantiate in your own life. So I would highly encourage you to go and spend some time there. And I think this part of the online discourse, I'm going to try to pull a few more figures in from it to discuss the relationship between the cultivation of virtue, the emergence of alternative alternative candidate ruling classes, and the political future of our nations. I think this is a really interesting space, and I'd like to explore it a little bit further. So let me know in the comments, what you guys think about it, and whether you enjoyed this deviation from our usual hard-headed analysis of Canadian politics. Thank you, Johann, and we'll speak to you all soon.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.